An older man with a long gray beard sat in the same old chair, faded from time, and looked through the dusty windows at the children playing in the yard. Through the thick white eyebrows overhanging his eyes, he looked out into the distance, his thoughtful gaze expressing the sadness and pain of memories of years gone by. He thought it was him, Mikey, running after the ball, laughing with them, and suddenly falling. The thought came suddenly like a splinter through his whole being, his gray beard heaving on his chest from his heavy, senile breathing. He had lived more than 9 decades and knew exactly who had guarded him on this earth all these years. The memories came instantly, and with them came large, bitter tears streaming down his cheeks. Mikey had never had parents, never seen them, never knew anything about them. The word family did not exist for him until a certain point. His family had been the inhabitants of an orphanage since birth, but even there, he had never been told who his parents were or where he came from. The pain of the abuse inflicted on little short Mikey during his time in the orphanage remained in his memory for years to come. No, he was not weak at heart, but he was weak and underdeveloped physically, and illness and injury had accompanied the boy from birth. Perhaps these were the consequences of his birth from dysfunctional parents. His entire childhood in the orphanage was remembered only as a series of fights and quarrels. The tougher ones never missed an opportunity to give little Mikey a smack or a push in the back. No one in the orphanage wanted to be his friend, even for a minute, except the nurse, Ellen, who sometimes stood up for the boy in quarrels, and the dragonfly Emmy, as small as he was. He caught it on a walk and kept it ever since in a little box with holes in it. Mikey often talked to her, read books, and sometimes cried, telling her his grievances. But after a while, he realized that as much as he loved Emmy, her place was among others like her. So he was left friendless, letting his only friend out into the world. Life continued to drag on in its sad sequence. But one summer day, everything changed. Mikey remembered that Sunday morning at the beginning of summer as if it had been yesterday. An elderly couple showed up at the shelter, and he was immediately introduced to her as a child with poor social adjustment. The older woman's eyes, looking at Mikey, radiated light and kindly sparkled. Her name was Sarah, and she talked a lot with the shelter mistress. The boy could hear them discussing his health, character, and progress in school. At that moment, he listened to the words, abandoned since birth, for the first time. Unlike his wife, Sarah's husband, Phil, was silent primarily and coughed into his fist. Mikey noticed his rough, calloused hands. It was clear that Phil made his living by hard physical labor. Despite the apparent difference between the spouses, they quickly agreed on one thing, a desire to adopt the frail, messy boy. And by evening, he and his new family were arriving at their future home on the city's outskirts. The house stood by the forest, which exuded the pleasant scent of pine after the rain, among identical village houses. On the other side were the fields where the locals toiled to earn bread. They were unusually bright this summertime, and it seemed to Mikey that he had always lived near such beauty. A shallow stream was running nearby, muddy and dirty, but small fish were splashing in it. What else did the little orphan need to be happy? His new parents toiled from morning till late at night in the fields and on the farm to support themselves and Mikey. The boy was almost always alone, but that loneliness was far better than the brutal antics of the orphanage boys. In the morning, he ran errands for Sarah and Phil, and afterwards, he enjoyed his free time. On one of those ordinary days of loneliness, Mikey sat in the yard and squinted at his reflection in a muddy puddle. Through the light bars of the fence, he suddenly saw a mud-stained face, an equally mud-stained white dress, and white sandals. As Mike later called her, the girl in white was holding on to the bars, sticking her face through them. He asked the unknown visitor as he stepped outside, "I am Velma. I live in the neighboring street." Velma shouted and ran so fast that she flashed a dress and white sandals with muddy mud flying out from underneath. The boy ran after her to places he had never been before, village houses passing by until Velma came running to a well. It was deep enough, and they bent over and shouted into the abyss, listening back to the long-awaited echo, laughing and stomping. It was the best day of Micah's bitter life, and when the girl suddenly ran around the well screaming, "Catch me, touch me," he immediately rushed after her. The boy hardly remembered falling and hitting something hard that followed. He woke up in his new home, his foster mother sitting over him, putting a cold towel on the huge bump on his forehead. The abrasions on his legs hurt terribly, but his only thought was, "Where is the girl in white now? What is the matter with me, Mother? How long have I been lying down? Come on, Mikey. Our neighbor, Uncle Ron, saw you fall next to the well on your way back from the field. He brought you home, and Maggie, his wife, came running to the farm for me, and it wasn't long before I got back to you. Was I alone there by the well? Well, of course you were, silly. Don't touch your forehead with your hand. Where are you going, Mikey? The boy jumped out of bed and dashed across 2 neighboring streets to Velma's house. The old house stood in a lonely spot next to an abandoned cemetery and had long been overgrown with nettle bushes. A bearded older man peered out the window and, squinting his eyes with disapproval, asked, "What are you making noise for?" "I'm looking for Velma. Is she home?" "She's been gone for 3 years. She's dead. She fell in the well. They didn't have time to pull her out." And the grandfather shut the window sash. Mikey's thoughts rushed from one to the other. Not understanding anything, he asked himself, "How? Was I asleep? And was it a vision?" As he walked around the old crooked fence, the boy saw 2 broken boards in it. Without thinking long, he woke up through the gap and rushed toward the house once in the yard. As he ran closer, Mikey peered through the window. It was quiet and dark inside the house. He ran over to another window, looked in, and froze. There was a picture hanging on the opposite wall, a picture of Velma. She was wearing the same dress he had first seen her in. She looked exactly as she did in real life. Her expression was sad. The picture on the wall was skewed, which made it seem as if the eyes of the girl in white were looking at him reproachfully from under her bushy eyebrows. A candle burned on the side of the table beside the painting, the glare of the flame casting a hint of anger and a touch of sadness and a smile on Velma's face. Mikey stood up, reaching over to fix the picture, but he couldn't call it. "Why are you doing this, Mikey? Get out of here quickly," thought the boy. But the eyes of his acquaintance drew him in like a magnet. The memories of yesterday's encounter with Velma raced through his mind. He remembered the older man's words in the window, and goosebumps crawled up his skin. But who had he been with yesterday? Mikey looked around for a chair but saw nothing. As if in a dream, he began to move silently through the rooms that were foreign to him, looking for a chair. In the third, he found what he was looking for, a small folding chair with wobbly legs. Deciding it would do, Mikey began to make his way back. Holding his find in his hands, the boy lifted his head and looked at the carina. It was hanging perfectly straight. The room was as quiet and empty as before he came out of it. "What on earth is going on?" thought Mikey, and his heart began to clench harder and harder. At that moment, the candle that had almost burned out fell, and the tablecloth was engulfed in flames. The flames quickly spread to the furniture, the floor, and the curtains on the windows. The boy wanted to run, but could not. His legs would not listen to him. He stood and stood until the dried hands of the older man picked him up and carried him out of the burning house. People ran from all sides. Cries and shouts could be heard, and the boy ran away toward his house. He distinctly heard a familiar voice from all these voices. "I will always keep you safe." It was already dark. The full moon was shining, and Mikey ran, realizing with horror that he could not see his own shadow beside him and the prints of his boots in the mud. And when he looked up, he saw no stars in the sky. He ran past the cemetery, stumbling and not feeling the ground beneath his feet. It seemed to him that ugly creatures accompanied him on either side, moving with him and scratching at the bark of the trees with their ghastly claws, moaning and sighing. But even these sounds were cut through again by the painfully familiar voice. "I will always cherish you." Time seemed to fall into this darkness. He tried with all his might to run, but it felt like he was standing still. His cotton legs felt like he had grown to the ground, and the nightmarish shadows of ugly creatures stretched their arms toward him. At last, Mikey managed to reach the familiar outline of his home. Somewhere, the pleasant aroma of the forest air after the rain was gone, replaced by the nauseating smell of swamp and decay. The black pine needles of the trees fell on top of him. He turned around and saw the shadows of ugly creatures moving behind him, near the forest, and among them, the familiar shade of a girl in white. He rushed to run faster. His breath was hard. His legs were scratched, and his pants were torn to shreds. Gasping for breath, he ran to the gate, pulled it with a force he had never had before, ran into the house, reached his bed, covered his head with a blanket, and cried. Whether from pity for Velma or from fear, he did not know. He still did not know. All he knew was that these events in little Mikey's life had influenced the rest of his life. It was varied and full of exciting events and risks. Mike Millers had since found himself on the edge of a precipice, one step away from death. But Velma had always chosen life for him. The day after those terrible events, he returned to where the fire had been yesterday. There were ashes in the place of the old house, in the midst of which lay a whole, untouched by fire, painting, and another stingy old tear rolled down the scars of his cheek.